To prevent war, we need to prepare for it. It's time to shift to a wartime mindset. And this means we need to make our defenses even stronger by spending more on defense, producing more and better defense capabilities. We need to support Ukraine more to change the trajectory of the war. We all want it to end, but above all, we want a peace to last.
And we want a peace to last. That's new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte addressing a council in NATO just hours ago. Actually, this is very fresh stuff, just off the mill. And to try to help us break some of this down, we have one of our favorite guests, Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. Wow, what a topic to start off with. I mean, we're looking to try and get the Ukraine war wrapped down and to try to get back to peace. And he's talking about ramping up preparations for war. What's going on with this guy?
Well, exactly. I mean, what he's talking about is essentially a situation of permanent war. Guns are better than butter. That was once said by a certain gentleman in Germany in the 1930s. I mean, that's essentially the message that he's conveying to people in Europe now, at a time when Europe's economy is in crisis, when we see political tensions growing in every European country. And as far as he's concerned, the way that we can get out of our problems is by militarizing our societies, increasing arms spending, spending more on defense, and getting ourselves in permanent conflict with the Russians and backing Ukraine. Now, none of that is going to happen. None of that is going to work. Europe, I think, is not in a position where it can do all of these things. But talking in this way does have consequences. First of all, it upsets and concerns the Russians because they see a very belligerent NATO, a NATO that is completely irreconcilable. It cuts across what I am increasingly getting the sense Donald Trump wants to do. He's now wanting to speak with the Russians. He wants a meeting with Putin. He's talking about ending the war, the very war that Mark Rutte wants to prolong. And of course, it's a message which European publics increasingly show signs of not wanting to listen to. But it's a message which is going to be received in Ukraine as a message that the Europeans are all behind them, and that if they continue the war, if they continue fighting, the Europeans are going to come to their rescue, which is not going to happen.
Well, let me just ask you about that seeming contradiction or dichotomy. Explain to us a little bit for the audience on this side of the pond. What is the I guess the sides that are going on in Europe, because you have the ones that like Slovakia and Hungary that seem to be kind of on one side country wise a little bit. Then you have Starmer in UK and Macron in France seem to be kind of on the other side there. And there seems to be the dueling for, let's just keep going with military stuff. And then the other side saying, I'm sick of the military stuff. Let's get back to just living a normal life. And I wonder to what extent those are the kind of couple of countries that are facing that. But even within individual societies, do you see the same kind of conflict going on?
You absolutely do. But let's talk about the countries first, because we are now starting to see signs of a peeling away. Now, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, basically there was only one country in Europe that stood out and opposed this constant rush for war. And that, of course, was Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Now, as the war is visibly being lost, and more people across Europe can see that, as they become more and more frustrated with the course of the war, as they see economic crisis grow across Europe, you're starting to see shifts, and you're starting to see domestic shifts within countries. So Slovakia joined Hungary. They had an election. Prime Minister Fico was elected. He's taking a position very close to that of Viktor Orban. Though I want to stress, Fico politically positions himself on the left, whilst Orban positions himself on the right. They've come to these views from different political positions, but they've converged. Now, we're soon going to have elections in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, not Slovakia, in the Czech Republic. It is widely expected that the winner will be the former Prime Minister, Mr. Babiš. He takes similar views to those that the Hungarians and the Slovaks are taking. And we've also had elections in Austria and the New Freedom Party in Austria. It also is now likely to form the next government, and it takes the same perspective as Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic. Now, what's very interesting here is that this is the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these countries were formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you're starting to see they're all coming together. They're taking similar perspectives on this conflict. They're saying it's gone far enough. It has got to end. Now, that's a group of countries that is emerging, which is opposing the war. Within every European country, there are conflicts. Germany is perhaps the most sharp one at the moment because they're in the middle of an election. You have two parties that have emerged, the AfD and the BSW, both of which are speaking out against the war. The AfD is gaining traction. It's growing. But there are internal tensions within Germany over this. There are internal tensions within France, in Spain, in Italy. Perhaps the only country in Europe where of the big players which remains united still to a great extent supporting the war is Britain. Even Poland, by the way, which I know quite well, there are cracks. So the divisions in Europe are growing. The big countries still support the war, but we're starting to see a whole group of Central European countries, the smaller countries, the former Habsburg countries, they're beginning to split away.
Now, let's take a look at some of the reasons for that may be, because I'm going to show you here another clip from Mark Rutte this morning where he's going to lay out some things that are actually accurate, some things that are facts. His interpretation of what they mean, I think, will diverge sharply among the two groups you just talked about there. But let's take a look at this, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions on the backside.
Our future security is at stake. Russia's war against Ukraine rages on. Russian hostile actions against our own countries are accelerating, with cyber attacks, assassination attempts, acts of sabotage, and more. We used to call this hybrid, but these are destabilization actions and campaigns. Russia is hard at work to try to weaken our democracies and chip away at our freedom. And it is not alone. It has China, North Korea, and Iran by its side.
Okay, several things I want to talk about there. First of all, it seems a little rich for him to be talking about attempted assassinations allegedly by the Russians in Europe when the Ukrainians just literally assassinated a Russian general a month ago in the very streets of Moscow, not far from the Kremlin, as a normal act of what they're doing there, but we want to condemn it. But anyway, I won't digress too far into that right now. But several of the other things he said, he characterized what Russia is doing in response to the war like, chipping away at democracy, which he didn't define what that means. But some of the other things, there have been a number of acts of sabotage that have been widely attributed to the Russian side. But what he doesn't say, why is Russia doing all of these things? It's because of all the actions that the West is putting on them. And of course, they're pushing back. And it's actually been a long time. It took a long time for these things to start manifesting inside Europe. But I wonder if you could tell me how that set of facts is animating on the one side, those like Rutte that say, yeah, we need to do more stuff against Russia. And the other side that says, well, this is stupid. Let's just stop it.
Well, exactly, because I think you've put it exactly. Every action that we take in a war inevitably provokes an opposite reaction from the other side. So if we start imposing sanctions on the Russians, if we start supporting assassinations inside Russia, which implicitly we have been doing, we've never condemned them. If we start, lobbying missiles inside Russia, we'd start doing all of those kind of things. Inevitably, in some form or another, the Russians are going to respond. And what we do is we ignore the things that we are doing and we focus exclusively on what the Russians are doing. And we say that this proves that they are aggressive and dangerous to ourselves, completely disregarding the fact that we are ourselves, in effect, driving the process. It is we who have taken steps which have led the Russians to do these things. Now, among some of those countries that we've been talking about, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, the others, well, I was recently in Hungary, and they are acutely aware of this. They are acutely aware of the fact that it is escalation on our side, which is provoking escalation from the other side. They are very concerned there. And remember, in a sense, that they are frontline states. They are much closer to Russia than, say, the Netherlands is. The Netherlands, of course, is in Western Europe. These countries are in Central Europe. The Hungarians pointed out to me, we have fought 6 wars against the Russians. We know exactly what it is like to fight the Russians. We don't want this to happen to us all over again. So these countries are saying, we can't go on escalating and inviting counter-escalation upon ourselves. We've got to break this cycle by seeking peace. And that is the argument that they're making. And it is being increasingly heard right across Central Europe, and even in countries like, as I said, Germany and France and Spain to some degree. And I'm no doubt eventually it will be heard in Britain.
It doesn't appear to be heard in Britain so far. It's interesting. No. You said that a lot of people in the Central and Eastern Europe want a lasting peace. Well, that's ironically the very phrase that Rutte used in wanting more militancy. He said, we want a peace that will last. But it's just curious. And I wonder, from the folks on that side of it, what is their argument? Because there is no diplomacy whatsoever mentioned in that. None whatsoever. Not in that clip, not in any of the others. And he doesn't even want to talk about anything from the Russian perspective. So when he says that they basically want a military mindset, a wartime mindset, because, I mean, everyone understands, I mean, at all times, you have to prepare for war in order to deter, having to go to war. That's why you have militaries. I mean, that's why they exist in peacetime. But he specifically wanted to escalate to a wartime mindset, which means that you're preparing to fight. Now, how do they argue that that will lead to peace in the absence of diplomacy?
Well, I mean, what they say is that this basically commits us to an unending military provocation, a confrontation with the Russians, which we cannot realistically afford. It is creating a rearmament crisis in Europe, which is far more likely ultimately to lead to war than to prevent it. That, by the way, is the European experience. It's very, very much the experience in the Habsburg lands. Remember, the Habsburg lands was where the world wars began. It was Austria's ultimatum to Serbia, which eventually provoked the First World War, and the European crisis, which led to the world wars. So, they know all about how endless rearmament, endless military preparations, wartime outlooks, what they can lead to. But they also make the point that what Rutte is trying to commit us in Europe to is the prolongation of a war, which we are losing and which ultimately is already lost. So it doesn't make any kind of sense anyway to do that. Instead of trying to prolong this war, we should be trying to end it now before we lose it even more badly than the way we're losing it now. And
okay. So the question comes in, that's rational and logical, what you just said there. you live in the UK, so I'm sure that others that I'm assuming anyway that others in the UK have that view, but your prime minister doesn't, nor does the president of France, who are actively talking about, in light of what you said is self-evident that Ukraine is not winning the war. I mean, even the advocates of more war and more war support recognize that the Ukraine side is losing. But explain to me then, why then does the UK prime minister and the French president want to send their troops to patrol some kind of a negotiated settlement?
Well, I think there's two reasons for this. Reason one is that they're trying to engineer a peace which isn't really a peace. They want to create a situation where they basically win on the through the diplomatic table, through some kind of diplomatic sleight of hand. They want to achieve an outcome which would be very close to a kind of military victory. So you freeze the front lines, you achieve some kind of a ceasefire, then you pour Western armies in, British and French troops.
But Alexander,
yeah.
I mean, I think you and I would both mock that idea that Russia would ever, under any circumstances in the current environment, agree to allowing them to come in there.
Yes.
Do the people in 10 Downing Street not recognize that?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm not sure that all of them do, if I have to be honest. But some undoubtedly do. And this is the other point here, because, of course, they don't really want peace at all. They want the war to continue. They're putting proposals forward that they know the Russians will reject. And what they're hoping to do is that they will then come to the Americans, to Donald Trump, and they will say, look, we are ready for peace. We're ready to send our peacekeepers there to Ukraine to patrol the peace. We're going to take this burden off your hand. It's the Russians who are not being reasonable, and therefore you must recommit to the war and even escalate it, because that's the only way you will bring these people back to reason, force them to the negotiating table, and produce a peace that is acceptable to us. So this is partly.
But does that mean then that there are those in that camp in the UK and probably elsewhere in Europe that actually think, after 3 years of war, that there is any kind of method, path, arms package, something that could undo everything that hasn't been done in the last 3 years, that could allow them to, from a position of strength, to dictate a diplomatic outcome for the Russians?
Incredible though it sounds, I think there is. This is where we come back to the kind of discussions that have been taking place in Europe amongst a lot of European leaders. It's very understandable that people like yourself, who are military people, you look at the situation on the battlefronts, you look at the state of European armies, you look at the state of the situation in Ukraine, you look at the sentiments of the United States, the capabilities there, and you say, look, this isn't a reversible situation. I'm not sure that Macron and Starmer understand that. What they think is, if we can persuade the Americans to step in, if, for example, we can get them to directly threaten the Russians in some way, that will make the Russians back down, because the United States still overmatches the Russians to such an extent that the Russians will not want to take on the Americans. And that is the gamble. And it is a gamble, by the way, but I think it's a gamble that, if you read the newspapers here, if you look at the commentaries, if you look at the discussions in the British think tanks, this is what they always say, that the war is being lost not because we lack the means to win it, it's because we, and by we they ultimately mean the Americans, lack the willpower to.
Wow. Well, that is you use the right word. It's a gamble. It's not a risk. It's a gamble to go down that road, because I'll just, and we could spend a whole show on this. I can tell you categorically that the United States is not in a military overmatch with the Russians right now. In fact, it's the opposite. Our entire active duty army is 480,000, I think, something like that. Russia has about 300,000 or 200,000 more than that in Ukraine alone, and they're battle hardened, they're trained, they're equipped for the new modern stuff. You can't say that about any of our side here. We don't have any combat experience in this kind of war. It's very, very different. So if anyone's thinking that we have the capacity, much less the will, they are mistaken. And yet, here just hours ago is Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Kiev making this kind of statement.
We must look at how this war could end, the practical ways to get a just and lasting peace. We agree that it must be a peace that guarantees your security, your independence, and your right to choose your own future. We will work with you and with all of our allies on steps that would be robust enough to guarantee Ukraine's security, guarantee any possible peace, and deter any future aggression. That conversation will continue in the months ahead.
But tell me, I mean, people in Britain, when they, even if they don't have all the information, they see 3 years of war has done nothing but shrink down the Ukraine side. They're losing territory. So when they hear Keir Starmer come out there and say, we're working for a just peace, and of course, by definition, he means that the Russians lose. Okay, you can want that, you can desire that, you can hate Russia, etc. But at some point, doesn't there come a point to where even advocates of that outcome say, yeah, but we've tried everything we could for 3 years. What more can you do that's going to change the tide? And that's an unrealistic outcome.
Right. Now, this is where we come to Britain, and because it's, the country that I know. Now, this is a point that is actually quite widely understood in Britain by many, many people. If you go to bars, pubs, if you engage people in conversation, they will talk this. If you speak to people in everyday life, they will talk this. I don't have much contact with the British military, but I've heard from various people that there are British people in the British military who absolutely have a completely realistic understanding of what's going on in Ukraine and of the fact that what's been tried for 3 years isn't going to work if it's tried again. The problem is that in Britain, the political class has retreated into a kind of fortress over Ukraine. They have constantly repeated this thing, that this is a just war, that we have to win, that Russia must be defeated. In Boris Johnson's words, Russia must not only lose, but be seen to lose. They've been saying this again and again. All of the major political parties have signed up to this. And the media has completely signed up to this. So that is closed off discussion. It would take a very brave political figure in Britain from any of the mainstream parties to come out and talk a different, say something different. Now, there are people in politics who are starting to take the first tentative steps in that direction. Nigel Farage is one. He's written 1 or 2 articles saying this was not an unprovoked war and we shouldn't call it so. There's Lord Skidelsky, very, very celebrated historian in Britain, a man for whom I have enormous respect. He's in the House of Lords. He's increasingly been speaking about this. So has David Owen, the former Labour Foreign Secretary, important politician of one period. But this has not yet broken through into the political class. And I don't think it will, unless there is either a major military cataclysm in Ukraine or unless something happens from the United States that basically breaks the ice, leads us towards a negotiation.
Well, no, that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Will have to
the next thing I wanted to talk about, because everything that Keir Starmer is saying here has been in lockstep with the Biden administration. That's what they continue to sing from that sheet of music to this day. But that's only going to be the case for about 5 more days. And then there's going to be a new sheriff in town, and he is doing everything in his power. And that's all he talks about is actually ending this war through the best negotiated deal he can get as quickly as he can get. The outside he's even talking is 100 days, which, you know, is a little more than the one that he talked about during the campaign trail, but that's a separate issue. But the point being that historically, in recent decades, the UK has been an absolute outright supporter of whatever the administration says, Republican or Democrat. So how is Starmer going to go from talking like we just put him on the screen there and some of these headlines that Gary's been throwing up there about how they're going to, you know, vow to strike strongest position and they're going to keep doing all this stuff when Trump is already talking about cutting back support and everything else? How is he going to like do a 45-degree angle change? Is he going to try to change Trump's mind? How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, he is going to try and change Trump's mind. There's been a lot of discussion about this in the British media, and I can say straight away, good luck to that. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump is going to change his policies because the British Prime Minister wants him to is ridiculous. Anybody who understands things can see that. But that doesn't mean that, you know, Starmer isn't going to try. What happens when American policy shifts? And I have to say here, Trump gave a press conference a couple of days ago in which he made he said something which has not been said before. He said that for the Russians, NATO expansion was the big issue, and that the fact that the Russians didn't want NATO on their doorstep was something that he could understand. Now, that is a almost revolutionary statement, certainly in terms of the kind of narratives and rhetoric we've been hearing in Britain. It's a statement, by the way, that the Russians have noticed. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has been speaking about it. He said that for the first time, a Western leader has grasped the causes of the crisis. I mean, it's the most extraordinary press conference that Lavrov has given. So when all of this starts to happen, when the Americans and the Russians start talking with each other, the British Prime Minister risks being left behind. As a British person, understanding the limitations of the power of my own country, I am concerned about that. I think that for that reason alone, the British Prime Minister needs to moderate his rhetoric and to start thinking more realistically about what is coming. But for the moment, at least, he continues to be in denial. Much of the British political class continues to be in denial. They continue to believe or hope that the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians will fail, and they will be able to do what I said before, blame it all on the Russians and get Trump to do a 180-degree change in his course and support the war and continue to prolong the war in the way.
Well, that's a pretty big risk, and one might even say it so far as a gamble, because you mentioned Robert Fico a minute ago from Slovakia. He has, I think, him and second, or following the Hungarian prime minister has basically said, all right, we see where this is going. We see what the truth is on the ground, and we're staking our political futures on this. So for those who may not know, Robert Fico is going to face a vote of no confidence on the 21st of January because of his outspoken comments about the war, the fact that he went to Russia, et cetera. And he is willing to take that risk because he views that it is in the best interest of his country not to go down this path. And here's something he said just a few days ago when talking about Zelensky. It was getting kind of aggravated because Zelensky, at least according to Fico's version of it, they had a negotiation because they had been getting some Russian gas through Ukraine. And as of January 1st, that got cut off. And Fico did not like at all the negotiations that happened that caused that to get cut off. Here's what he said a few days ago about how he views Zelensky now.
Nie som na to, aby som šiel po ruke prezidentovi Zelenskému. A priznám sa, že už niekedy mám plné zuby. Chodí po tej Európe, len žobre a vydiera, ostatných pýta peniaze. Jednoducho toto musí skončiť. Skúste trošku myslieť aj na túto krajinu. Nie iba na svoje úzkoprosé politické cieľ. Čo budeme robiť pre Boha, keď ten plyn nebude? Vy si myslíte, že Nemci nám pošlú plyn, keď oni budú mať málo? Nepošlú nám nič. Nič nám nepošlú.
So here's the potential risk as I see it. Now, there was Fico taking his political future into his own hands, that he recognizes the difficulty. I think we have a headline here that he's going to face a vote of no confidence here in just a week or so, the day after Trump is inaugurated, by the way. Presently, from what I read earlier today, that he thinks he might have been able to make a deal with one of the minority groups, and he thinks he's going to survive that vote of no confidence. We'll see how it is. But the bottom line is that he believes this so strongly, he's willing to risk everything, political life, for it. And when you talk about when Trump's coming in, that we actually have that clip that you referred to a minute ago about what he said with NATO, and I want to play that and then combine that with what Fico said.
A big part of the problem was Russia for many, many years, long before Putin said you could never have NATO involved with Ukraine. Now, they've said that that's been like written in stone. And somewhere along the line, Biden said, no, they should be able to join NATO. Well, then Russia has somebody right on their doorstep, and I could understand their feeling about that. But there were a lot of mistakes made in that negotiation. And when I heard the way that Biden was negotiating, I said, you're going to end up in a war. And it turned out to be a very bad war. And
that's probably enough of that, Gary. That's right. But you see there that I mean, that's what you were talking about. So here comes Trump, that he said, NATO, I understand that's probably why the war started in the first place. And I get that. Ergo, NATO won't even be on the table when he comes in. You have Fico pushing in this direction here. And then over here, you have Starmer even being more out front than Emmanuel Macron in France. So it seems like he's kind of putting himself out there on a limb, because if Trump comes in and moves in the direction of Fico or Orban and starts giving them more, happiness, then that's going to make Starmer look a little bit weaker. And how's that going to work for relations going forward?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I mean, I should say that Starmer's own position in Britain is not as stable as it should be. I mean, we are probably in economic recession. There's lots of criticism of the government. If I have to say, I think that Starmer's calculation at the moment is that, given that the political class here in London are only united basically on one thing, which is support for Ukraine, it is safe for him politically at the moment to support Ukraine.
If they're even potentially in a recession, aren't the voters, even if they may be inclined to hate Russia, won't they at some point go, wait, why do you want to send all of our money over to Ukraine when we're having a hard time here? Does that play?
Well, the great problem is this: we still haven't got a proper debate about all of these issues in Britain. I mean, this is where we haven't really got started. In Germany, they have. In France, absolutely, they have. In Britain, so far, we have not. And until that happens, and it will one day, I mean, it will happen sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later. But until that happens, we can't really address these issues properly, because for the moment, it seems safer for someone like Starmer to go to Kiev and to sign ludicrous 100-year treaties with the Ukrainians than to face the realities on the Ukrainian battlefronts and the realities that the United States under President Trump is likely to change course. So that's the problem we have in London. In other European capitals, it is different. I know that Fico is facing challenges. We see that other challenges have happened in other European countries. In Romania, an entire election was, well, the first round was annulled, and the second round was cancelled because the leading candidate also wanted to take a position very close to Fico's. So there are major political risks in going down that particular course. But I suspect that after the inauguration of the new president in the United States, the whole balance of this discussion will start to shift, probably not decisively immediately, but eventually gradually. and we will start to see the debate that needs to happen right across Europe reach Britain as well.
And I mean, let's circle back to the opening clip that we showed here about Mark Rutte wanting to take NATO onto a war footing and a war mentality, because that's expensive. That costs a lot of money. And if the economics are an issue here, but then he said, and it was similar to what Starmer had said, was, they want a just peace, which of course they defined what just is from the British/Western point of view. Well, the problem is, actually, there's two real problems with this. If that's what they're setting as an objective, then they're setting themselves up for yet more failure. And there's two big reasons that I want to talk about in the remaining time we have here. First of all, I want to look at on the diplomatic land. So you're trying to seek an end defined by the Western side that we want to read with justice, which of course is Russia getting out of Ukraine. But on the Russian side, they're going back not just to the NATO issue, which was, maybe the number one spark that caused this war to begin in the meantime, but also because of the focus, not what the West says from the Russian side, not to conquest, to recreate the Soviet Union or to keep going past Ukraine if they win that, etc., but because they care about the ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine. Lavrov made that point very clear yesterday.
The return of Donald Trump has fueled speculation of a peace deal in Ukraine. Is he the master deal maker he claims to be? And how far is Russia willing to go? What concessions are you willing to make to reach an agreement?
Neither the narrative nor anyone's discourse has addressed the rights of Russians, whose language, whose culture, education, media, and whose canonical religion were banned by law in Ukraine. There will be no serious conversations if the West pretends that this is normal. And when the outgoing administration in the person of Blinken and Sullivan says that they are confident that the new White House will continue the policy of supporting Ukraine, is this a testament to exterminate everything Russian as before?
Now, for the benefit of our audience who may not have seen our show earlier today, where I had Doug McGregor on, was asking him a similar question here. I'm going to, in order to put Lavrov's comments in context, I'm going to throw the map up here. What you see here, this is, of course, the current line of contact. These gray areas, these three right here, are in the southern three provinces that Putin declared is the minimum that he would even talk about a negotiated settlement back on the 14th of June of last year. And of course, the Ukrainians people are in this right now. But there's also a lot of ethnic Russians around the Kharkiv area, certainly down around Odessa, and all scattered throughout this area. So Lavrov saying, hey, if whatever deal we end up making, wherever the line turns out to be, whether it's here, something further, this one, whatever, there's still a lot of ethnic Russians in here. And the whole reason that we were helping the Donbass in the first place, even going back to 2014, was because the Ukraine government was trying to take the rights away from those people. So they have now shed a lot of blood and treasure to come in and try to protect the people physically by taking territory on the background. If anyone thinks that Lavrov or Putin is going to negotiate a deal that doesn't have protection for all these folks here and is going to just trust the West, I think that they're sadly mistaken. So if Starmer and everybody in that, and Rutte and everybody on that wing of the Western thought thinks that you can just negotiate all that away, that the Russians are going to be fine with it, it seems like they haven't been paying much attention. What do you think of that fact?
Well, they haven't been paying much attention. And can I say that one of the glaring problems, if you're talking about the way in which this war has been covered here in Britain and in much of Europe, is that the issue of the ethnic Russians is never talked about. I mean, it's as if these people don't exist, and that this is all something that the Russians are just talking about, but that there isn't really any reality to these concerns that the Russians are expressing. It's just somehow propaganda from the Russian side, if you like. It is not propaganda. The Russians really do care about these things. It is a matter of great concern to them. And it is going to be a major issue in the negotiations going forward. Now, there are problems. Ukraine has made all kinds of laws, passed all sorts of laws about the position of Russians, position of the Russian language. They have their own conception of how Ukraine should be formed and their own feelings about issues of language. These are very difficult questions in this part of Europe. So there is going to be a very complicated and very difficult negotiation to be agreed there. I would say that in Istanbul, it was possible for the Russians and the Ukrainians to reach quite a lot of consensus on these topics. I also get the sense that Donald Trump, who impresses me, by the way, as a man who has more understanding of these questions and takes them more seriously than many other Western politicians do, I think he will be alive to the importance of this issue for the Russians. I don't think it is an insuperable problem, but it is absolutely going to be there in the negotiations. And as Lavrov said, for the Russians, it is every bit as important as many of the other issues and topics that have been brought up over the course of this conflict, and one which they will insist must be solved.
Now, if this were just an issue of intellectual debate, if you wanted to sit, have people get into a room and everybody going to give their perspective on what they think is right, and then they have to try and convince, an audience, whatever, who's right or who's wrong, it would be one thing. And then the British could have their viewpoint that they have. The NATO could have its viewpoint. Russia could have its viewpoint. Ukraine could have its viewpoint. They could be all over the map, and there's just complaining and whatever. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of words. Well, here's the problem when it comes to solving this war. There is one more aspect that's at play here that's more than just words, and that is on the military side of this. And I just published earlier today in the publication 1945 here in Washington, an article that the title there is "Blame Joe Biden if Ukraine loses the war to Russia." But really what this is a detailed analysis from before the war started, well before the war started, all the way through to the current day, how the United States had at least 6 possibilities to either prevent the war from happening altogether, or to get it, take an off ramp to end the war. And we punted on every single one of them. As a result of our policies, of course, a lot of people have their fingers in the pie, but we're the number one. We're basically the leader in NATO, and we certainly have been leading charge in all this. Because of what has happened and all of the refusals to get the military off ramps, now then the military balance between the two is so skewed that here's the hard truth. Coming into this negotiation, Trump and Ukraine, they need a negotiated settlement. Putin doesn't. He does not have to negotiate anything he doesn't want. If he set the 14 June lines that I just showed you on the map there, if that's what he wants to do, he can do it. If he wants to take Odessa, if he wants to take Kharkiv, if he wants to go all the way to the Dnieper River, he can do it. He doesn't have to negotiate anything. He doesn't have to give away territory in Kursk or anywhere in the Donbass or anything else if he doesn't want. Even if he said, it'll take me another year, a full year of combat, they can do it. So when you take about all these sides in this discussion, they're not in an abstract. They're in the real world, anchored to the truth militarily that the Ukraine side will not be able to maintain its position. And if the negotiations drag on long enough, they'll just lose. Does no one realize that in UK?
Well, I think that some people do realize it, but not enough. And what you've outlined is the absolute reality. The Russians do not need to negotiate because they're in a position where they're going to win. And they know they are. Now, that doesn't mean the Russians won't negotiate. If you can persuade them that it is in their long-term interests to do so. And the Russians have said that they do think it is in their long-term interests to negotiate.
Agreed.
A settlement.
I agree with you.
Because their major concern is their security of their western borders and of their people. They've said this many times. Now, they also say that they understand perfectly well that in order to achieve that long-term security, they do need to come to an understanding with the West, first and foremost with the United States. That is the leverage that we have over them. We can point out to the Russians, yes, you can win in Ukraine, but only by coming to terms with us can you feel fully secure in terms of your Western borders. If you approach negotiations in that kind of way, then you have a real prospect of achieving success. If you go on talking about just peace, militarizing the West, shipping more weapons to Ukraine, trying to do, again, all the same things that have happened over the last 3 years, then the outcome will be exactly the one that you said. The Russians will just say, well, there's no point in talking to these people. Let's just go ahead and win the war and then see what we can do.
And you know, from reading a lot of the Russian Telegram channels and talking with a few sources I have that have access to the Russian mentality and Russian thinking at least reportedly some of the higher levels, there is a big debate inside Russia between Putin and his supporters and the military and the Kremlin that are really at odds, because apparently they're not too happy with Putin and his control and his patience, etc. They want him to bring in a much bigger hammer, and I think that so far Putin has been able to stay on, because I think he absolutely correctly recognizes what you just said and laid out that it is in Russia's long-term interest to get this thing negotiated away. I think for the first time since this war broke out, he sees it with the elevation of Trump. There's at least a possibility that Trump may recognize the same thing, and that they could find a win-win solution that's going to go long-term. Even if it'll be ugly in the near term, in the medium and long term, it would be good for both sides. But if we don't get there, if there's so much institutional pressure on Trump, because Trump has also got his internal dynamics, and if the neocon side, the warhawk side, and the U.S. side is able to put enough pressure on him to not make an ugly deal in the near term, then I think that increases the pressure against Putin to have a good negotiated settlement. And it says, you know what, we're just going to just keep rolling to the west until we've taken everything up to the river. We'll build a new defensive line there, and we'll make our security that way. And then we've got a new Cold War going forward, which could burn into a hot nuclear war, at any time. The chances will be high. So I think there's a great deal at stake here.
There's a huge amount at stake. And you've described it exactly correctly. Either we do a deal which actually stabilizes the situation in Europe, preserves Ukraine, preserves Ukraine, stabilizes the situation, and brings a long-term sustainable peace in Europe. A peace which we might not find optimal. We might want, things to ended up otherwise. But we're talking about the real world, not, the fantasy ideal world that we would like. Either we're going to get that kind of peace, or we are going to get another long-term geostrategic confrontation between us and the Russians in Europe. That will be a disaster for Europe. That will be an awful outcome for Europe. And of course, it is not what the United States and the US and the people of the United States want, and it does not serve US interests. The United States has made it very clear, at least the people of the United States have made it very clear, they want reconstruction at home, and they want the US to focus on priorities closer to home. And many people also say, well, we've also got concerns about what's going on in the Far East, and we need to look at that too. You can't be strong everywhere. You probably know this quote better than me, Daniel, as a military man, but I believe it was Frederick the Great said, he who defends everything defends nothing.
Yes, I'm very, very well acquainted with that as well. And, and in a positive direction, the incoming Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, in his confirmation hearings, all the media was focused on, some of these claims against him in the past about drinking too much, about, some sexual misconduct that he had, whatever. Everybody loves to talk about those things, but almost nobody paid attention to the substance of what he said he would do if he's actually confirmed as the Secretary of Defense. And one of the things that he said that he was specifically chosen by Trump was because he wanted to focus on national defense, the defense of the borders and the defense of our skies, etc. Those are the things that he said he wanted to highlight, which is exactly what you just said. In your view, the American people do. He recognizes that because they're the ones who elected him president. So if Trump gets his way and if he can resist the pressure, then, maybe there's a chance that we can get to that outcome, because I think you and me both know very well, maybe you know better than me on the European side, is that there are plenty of forces on both sides of this that would love to sabotage everything Trump's doing, and that they desire a new Cold War, because then that, potential hostility means lots of cash and lots of stuff, for the defense industry. And there's too many people that benefit from that. And when you say it's in the national interest of the United States, well, it's in the national interest of the people of the United States, but not necessarily some of the defense firms who would lose if we had peace. And that's I'm okay with that, but they do bring a lot of pressure to bear.
Well, that's absolutely right, and of course it's true in Europe. And by the way, you've described the argument that is being played out in Russia very, very accurately. You can see it developing there. The hardliners there are getting stronger. They've been getting stronger consistently right through the war. Putin is not one of them. He is resisting them. But absolutely, we do have all of these people who are present in Europe. They do exist, absolutely, who would prefer the outcome of a prolonged confrontation. There are similar people in the United States, but we have a choice. We need to exercise that choice wisely. It seems as if the new president, elected by the American people, wants to exercise that choice in that kind of way. I think what we should try and do is support him in his efforts. I'm not saying they will necessarily succeed. He's probably got all kinds of things to learn. He's probably going to meet Putin very long. But at least I personally feel that we now have a way forward. And I come back to what I said before. The Russians, Lavrov and Putin, have noticed what Trump has been saying. And if you go through the whole text of that press conference, which you can find on the Russian Foreign Ministry, you will see that Lavrov speaks about Trump in unusually warm terms, that this is finally someone has got it.
Well, man, we certainly hope that continues on. And I actually was interviewed by Tucker Carlson for a show that'll air here in the next few days yesterday. And one of the things we talked about in there was Tucker Carlson's interview with Lavrov. And in that we discussed how even in the context of some of the angst between the two sides, Lavrov referred to America as a great country. He's not denigrating it. He's not, we're the enemy and they want a Cold War. He's actually saying positive things about it. I actually missed that part of the interview today. I'll have to go back and yesterday. I'll have to go back and watch that. But there are some positive signs out there.
There are some positives. And to be absolutely clear, there are people in Russia who do not want a permanent confrontation with the West either. Putin, again, set it out in a speech he gave, I think it was in September 2021, to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board. He said, we need secure borders in the West because we need that in order to be able to focus on our own development. Dealing with our pressing domestic problems, we need peace.
Yes, and I am a big advocate of that. And anyone who's doing anything, whether it's your show there at the Duran or Tucker Carlson's show, ours here, and a number of others that are like it, we're going to keep talking things that can bring win-win and solutions for both sides and can bring this destructive war that should never have been fought to a rapid end so that the healing and the recovery can start. That's one of the things we're about, and we're so grateful for you coming on, showing your insights as always. So it's always a pleasure and a delight to have you on.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to come on to this show, if I may say. I absolutely love doing so.
And we certainly love having you here and look forward to the next time coming in. Thank you very much for you guys for joining us today. We have John Mearsheimer on. It's been a while since we've had him. I think this is the first time in this 2025. Always a big hit on our channel. Folks love to hear what he has to say, and you're not going to want to miss that either. 3:30 tomorrow afternoon here on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We will see you then.